or elderly, and also people who are needing rehabilitation.
City Alderman.
Shane Burkhart, Commission Member.
Lee Tall, Commission Member.
Joe Terry, Secretary.
Adam Tagan, Community Development.
All right, great. We have a fairly short agenda, but certainly no shortage of content. So we'll get right into update and discussion on the zoning rewrite project for Civitech, who is on their way to our meeting. We'll go ahead and get started on, I guess, a couple of those. I think the first page right after the agenda had a number of items identified for their discussion. Adam thought maybe the parking and storage piece, was it, Adam?
Yeah, kind of starting on page 7 of the packet, pages 7 and 8. It's content that we've discussed before. If you remember, we've had a number of discussions with Civitech on the concerns on which we were kind of informally talking about before, on the ways to encourage people or require people to be parking on hard surface, not on grass. If they have multiple vehicles, that they're properly stored. If they have recreational vehicles, that those are properly stored. So based on those discussions, pages 7 and 8 are kind of some specific regulations that Civitech put together to try and address those concerns. Obviously, the areas highlighted are some setbacks that would need to be kind of discussed and get a little direction given on. I can kind of go through and let you know what some of those are in our current code, just as a basis. But then it's really more of a, is this where we want to go? Is it firm enough? Do we want to be more aggressive on it? Just kind of a larger policy discussion on how we want to deal with vehicles and recreational vehicles. So for example, on page 7, that first letter C, when it's talking about driveway setbacks, our current code has a 3-foot driveway setback from side lot lines, and there is no exception when it comes to a common lot line. So for example, if you have 2 older homes and their driveways are right next to each other, right now our code says if you tear it out and rebuild it, you have to have that 3-foot setback, otherwise you need a variance. This particular language increases that, or I guess what their initial proposal is to go at 5 feet, but it does have an exemption in there that if you have a shared driveway, and I'm assuming that would require some sort of legal document, so it's not just a handshake between the neighbors, but something that says you're going to have a shared driveway, then you could actually pave up to the lot line, or kind of pave over the lot line, as it were. And then I do actually like the language where it's saying that on a cul-de-sac you can be closer than whatever setback that is, because a lot of times you have that pie-shaped lot, so you have very limited room to work with. But as long as it goes back, it ends up at that 5-foot or 3-foot or whatever setback requirement. So just kind of curious on setbacks, where we want, how aggressive we want to be on driveways or not. I want to say in the last, I've been here, 6-7 years, we've had probably 3 or 4 variance requests for driveway setbacks, and those are generally your older sections of town. It'll be a 50-foot wide lot, or even a normal size lot, but where the house was built, to get a 10-foot driveway in there, there's not room for that 3-foot setback. So I guess if you want my opinion, I think 5 feet is probably a little aggressive. I mean, on a brand new plotted subdivision where everything is 1/3 of an acre or 1/4 acre, and it's a clean slate, easy enough. But when you're looking at retrofitting those older driveways, that's going to be difficult to meet on a lot of lots.
I think especially when you start talking, a lot of people like to put bushes or trees along their lot line. Well, and then maybe they decide they want a garage in their backyard because their house never had one. Now you're kind of pushing that so close to the house too, that driveway or whatever, or so close to the lot line.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, a detached garage, for example, is 3 feet from a lot line is the setback requirement. So I don't know if that's
In the future code?
in our current code. Honestly, I don't know what it is.
I think that ratio or whatever that would be consistent would make sense if you're in the driveway approach or to your garage. So I guess that would be the one question I've got.
Yeah,
Is what the,
I don't know if we've gotten that.
so you were going to say
section
something
yet, to
too.
be honest.
Well, I was going to say too, with a 3-foot setback requirement, that means 2 driveways are going to be at least 6 feet from each other. That's certainly ample room. I think 10 feet away from each other starts to potentially take up some valuable lot space. I also had some concerns, the shared driveway concept, if there needs to be a width defined specifically for a shared driveway. To potentially, so that if neighbors agree, and even if there is some legal document that calls it a share, that it really isn't two driveways, that they just wanted to go, they agreed to go to the lot line, and you end up with, a really wide driveway when there's physically room for two of them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good point.
Yeah, some sort
You
of.
don't want it to be an end around the code.
Right.
You want it to be in a hardship, almost in a hardship situation where it's an older section of town that you're just trying to be more.
So you pull like a definition or something maybe for that item?
Yeah, and I would think maybe even a conditional use process, because again, if you look at the technical definition of a zoning variance, they have to otherwise demonstrate the lot is not usable, and I know that oftentimes that doesn't happen that way, but if there were to be any type of a challenge, that zoning board of appeals has no authority to grant any variance unless they've demonstrated that significant unnecessary hardship, and the Supreme Court's defined that. So, I think potentially some definition language, and and maybe even some conditional use language for the shared type driveway might make sense. We something to think about. I think 3 feet, maintaining 3 feet is consistent with what we have. I don't know that we want to change that.
I agree. I think it aspirationally sounds good, but it's really tough to probably accomplish in a lot of places in town.
I did verify that they are recommending accessory buildings be allowed within 3 feet of a side.
Okay.
So same as our current code.
So how does this work, when you get into some areas where we have alleyways and stuff like that, and now like on Second Avenue where you see a lot of the homeowners had to get rid of their Second Avenue driveway, and now they're using that gravel alley. But you'll see other residences that have their regular driveway off their city street, but then have an alley behind them and maybe have an outbuilding. Are we requiring any type of pavement back there off the alley, or?
If it's used for a parking of vehicles or the storage of vehicles, it would be under the same regulations regardless of whether or not it's off of an alley or a full-blown public street. So it should be hard surface, either concrete or asphalt, same situation.
Even though the alley might be grass or
Right.
gravel?
Yeah, I know at least in one situation on Second Avenue specifically, you needed a variance for the garage, and they granted a variance for the surface up until the time the alley is paved, because it didn't make a lot of sense in that situation because it is a gravel or a grass alleyway. But if I'm enforcing the letter of the law as it reads now, it would need to be asphalt or concrete.
Yeah, just reading the surfacing, the drain, just even the surfacing, I don't think there's really any opportunity for that to exist without any sort of surfacing. So we're sort of in consensus on the 3 foot, and then finding some way to accomplish this conditional question or something related to the shared driveway or common driveway, which we'll maybe put that in front of Tim to see how they want to accomplish that.
Yeah, I can communicate that.
Okay, with questions on the maximum?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know I guess if the commission has any specific thoughts on maximum or minimum widths for driveways specifically, otherwise I would probably lean on what's either in our existing code or, probably talk with Public Works, quite honestly, because those are fairly standard. It's usually not a community by community thing, so I don't know that there's anything there that necessarily I would specifically call out in that maximum widths section.
Yeah, and 24 feet's big enough to back a motor camper in or something like that without a lot of issue. And you know, from that viewpoint also, the 3-foot, the 3-foot setback requirement makes sense because you do have, if you have 2 adjacent driveways, your apron taper ends up taking up that space, so.
So then, as we look into the auxiliary parking bay, I've got a question. What's the definition of a front yard? Is that,
Front yard would be the distance between either A, the actual front of the home and the street, or B, 25 feet, or whatever that required setback is. So if the house is set back 50 feet and the required setback is 25 feet, technically the front yard, well, I should actually check how they define it. Now I'm speaking out loud. Usually it's going to be just from the front elevation of the home to the street, is
Right.
how I would enforce, or how I would interpret for the
So
purpose of this.
you're not allowing accessory buildings in the front yard, meaning from the front of the house to the street, not just the 25-foot
Yeah, the front
required
and
setback.
I'm just thinking an auxiliary parking bay question in lieu of Todd's question or comment about some of the homes that have a single stall garage, single stall driveway. They're using that front yard as the parking bay, and if we're gonna tell them they have to pave it, they can't pave that spot, obviously, so in which case it would be to the opposite side of the driveway, right? Am I speaking that correctly? Instead of being, let's say, if you're facing a home, instead of the driveway's on the right of the home, or the garage on the right side of the home, your parking bay cannot be on the left side of the driveway, as some people like to use their
Right,
front side
front
of
of
the
the-
front yard,
right.
really their front yard as opposed to.
Well,
And it needs to be alongside too, not front out.
Yes and no.
Oh, okay.
An auxiliary parking bay is, as kind of pictured here, that would be for storage of other vehicles.
Oh, sorry, okay.
Maximum width would cover your question.
Oh,
So if the house is closer than 40 feet from the right of way, you could actually have a driveway that's 24 feet wide, meaning you'd have room for 2 cars. But if it's a typical garage that's set farther back, then you could only have a 12-foot wide driveway. At least that's what letter, or number 1 under
Number 1 says.
magnificent
okay.
maximum width is saying. So kind of 2 different concepts. There's your traditional driveway, which would be that paved area between your garage normally and the street. This auxiliary parking bay would be if you want to pave a section next to it for storage.
Gotcha, okay.
So the maximum width can be exceeded if it's an auxiliary parking bay? I almost think requesting some kind of diagram of these minimum and maximums would be,
Yeah, I'm guessing that's what this figure would be.
The graphic down below.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could be.
But the auxiliary parking bay, again, that would be behind the front of the house. So that would be separate of the discussion on the maximum width. Maximum width is just really from the front of that garage to the street. And then your auxiliary parking bay, that's gonna be behind the front of the house. So it's really 2 different.
And it requires a taper, so, you know, does a taper need to be defined a bit? I mean, maybe I want to taper it all the way out to the street. Right?
It really doesn't say that you
It
can't.
But there-
it doesn't say you can't.
No,
well,
that's right.
on number 2, it says the taper starting at least 8 feet from the right-of-way line. There must be a taper starting.
8 feet from the right-of-way line,
Yeah.
but there again, if the setback is 40 feet, that taper could start a long way back.
Right. I mean, that's a question on, is the concern there being too much hard surface and too much concrete on the site, or is it just that you're trying to make sure that the vehicles are stored on a hard surface and they're designed properly?
Right, so I think, at least my concern is that the vehicles are being stored not in front of the house, but alongside the house.
Right.
And that if the taper, if the auxiliary parking bay is large enough and the taper's long enough, you could potentially store another car
Right.
or another vehicle or trailer or something in front of it, especially if you have 4 feet maybe from the edge of the house to your garage door, and you've got a 10-foot auxiliary parking bay that's a few feet away from your garage. Your taper could be more than enough room to store additional vehicles out front. Now, that could be taken care of, potentially with some other language, but if it's another vehicle that's being used regularly, you could suddenly park 3 vehicles in front of the
So
house.
if a lot isn't big enough to have one on the side, you just can't have one, I take it, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, so there will be plenty of lots in the older parts of town that wouldn't, an auxiliary parking
Yeah,
wouldn't
yeah.
even be an option.
Or with the maximum width situation as well, right? I mean, they wouldn't, some would have difficulty maybe with that.
But this maximum width is of the actual driveway portion, not the width in front of the garage where it's tapered.
Right. Yeah, so you could conceivably have a 24-foot wide driveway, and then it's gonna get wider as part of the taper going to that auxiliary parking bay. So yes, I guess getting back to your original question, yes, you were correct. You could exceed the maximum width because of the taper. I think, if I'm understanding the question.
I'm just, I guess my primary concern is that parking area. I'm less concerned probably about the amount of hard surface, other than within reason you can't pave, you know. So I guess I'm trying to balance a couple things, is this whole enforcement issue of people parking on their front lawns or side of their driveway and creating this big mud hole. But then trying to promote that it has to be hard surface, you know, I mean, do you want them on the, people parking in the street, or do you want them in their driveway, or, you know, just try to balance all those pieces together in my mind. Some streets just don't have the ability for a lot of on-street parking. You'd prefer to probably have the cars in the street, but there's the whole winter plowing thing that also creates some trouble.
You know, a lot of the problem is you have a 1 or 2 bedroom home and you have 6 people living in it.
Yeah.
You know, and they all drive.
Yeah.
You can't get
And there are
garage 'cause
other-
there's too much stuff in the garage.
Mhm.
And there are technically ordinances that can be enforced on some of those things, just minimum square footages for dwelling units and those type of things. They're not a fun process to enforce, to put it mildly, but that's in your international property maintenance code. So if it is a family of 8 living in a 1-bedroom home, that would technically violate that, and there are ways to enforce that. I've seen it used rarely. It's usually in extreme circumstances where there's actually health, safety, welfare issues, as opposed to just a neighbor complaint.
I do think though for taper, we are gonna wanna have some type of language describing it, because, you know, you could bring it out to within an inch of your overall width, and then in 50 feet, taper it an inch, and make the argument, well, it is a taper yet. It's only an inch, but it's wider here than there, so it's tapering.
Yeah.
You know, and defeat the objectives. You know, you obviously want enough room to be able to maneuver without trash in a yard or whatever, but
Yeah, I believe the intent, anyway, is that the taper, it couldn't just be an inch, it would have to be tapering from whatever that maximum width is down to the maximum that's allowed at the right of way.
right.
I mean, if it,
So straight taper, or,
yeah. So,
Okay.
But yeah, and whether or not a graphic can clean up some of that might.
sure.
Come on in.
My apologies.
Water's
Welcome,
fine.
that's fine, we
had
are
it in
diving
mind.
right into parking and storage, so
Okay.
we're making good use of the time, kind of talking about the various scenarios related to parking areas and driveways and widths and some of the dynamics that exist, so I
Yep.
think we made some progress in the time we were here, so.
Okay, good.
Really just the first page of 7 though, so we'll probably finish that up before we jump into one of the other items.
So in here, we don't list maximum width at the garage, or up at the garage. So, because that is the missing component to help identify this taper.
Well, in subsection 2, under maximum width, the width driveway directly in front of garage doors cannot exceed the width of the garage on that side. So basically, the garage size sets that maximum width at the garage. So if you have a 3-stall garage that's 40 feet wide, that's your maximum width at the garage, and then it has to taper down to that 24-foot if it's, or the 12.
I personally think we should go the width of the garage plus 3 feet or something, so that you can have a little wraparound for a garbage can, or a wraparound for a door, or something like that included in,
You have a side door. like that.
yeah. And I think of that because my rental property would have a non-conforming driveway.
Well, you're kind of saying almost like an auxiliary parking bay, but that it would be designed for storage of recycling containers, garbage, that type of thing.
You know, so something within reason of being able to have some kind of continuous concrete access to the,
And that's not accounted for in the parking bay?
Well, it's a
That's-
parking bay. If it's only 3 or 4 foot wide,
It's not a parking bay.
right, then it's, but is it a sidewalk or is it just part of the driveway?
It's a sidewalk.
okay.
So you could have that 3 foot alongside the garage either side for doorway or garbage or whatever. It's basically a sidewalk.
Okay.
But the parking area is really what's limited in terms of the width.
And so getting at the concern related, not that concern, but the other one about allowing folks to pave another parking bay in front of their garage that's wider than their single stall garage, you can or cannot do that within the maximum widths. We're talking about a visual kind
Right, a
of,
taper
so is that what the,
is
what
defined.
Well, okay. Basically, there are certain zoning aspects that are really difficult to nail down. Signage is one, this is another one, and then there's one other one that's just really hard to think of all the permutations and all the possibilities. So, with that as backdrop, what's the issue again, or the concern?
I'm just more concerned, we've got a lot of single stall garages that
Mhm.
are very close to the road. And so they barely allow for a single car to be parked in front of the garage, much less the one that they're trying to park on the front lawn. And so how are we going to accommodate some of these situations where we have these single stall garages when there is a space for a parking bay, not necessarily next to the garage, but next to the driveway, a driveway that's twice the width of the garage. That's still within your right-of-way and your your lot line. Or outside of the right-of-way and outside of the lot line.
Yeah.
So what's proposed you wouldn't be allowed to do that. It can't exceed the width of the garage.
And I'm just wondering, is it practical
Right.
to have that situation and when it's fairly prevalent?
But if it was close enough, the maximum width of the actual driveway could be 24 feet, getting you your double width,
Is that,
if I'm understanding this
and
correctly.
is that
Yeah, in a way, it's almost contradicting itself.
Okay.
Right. Because the driveway can be 24 feet, but then it says you would almost have to taper then back up to the garage width.
Unless we said, not exceeding the maximum width of the driveway. Or let people go up to the maximum width of the driveway.
Yeah, if the garage is
If
smaller
it
than
can
that.
fit. I mean, like Tim said, a lot of this is really hard to abstractly, until you start laying out each individual driveway and setback and stuff like that, so.
and maybe we just don't want to allow it. We get out of that business of having to accommodate people's multiple vehicles and things in those really small areas. And they have to park on the street.
But then they're gonna still just park in the yard anyways.
Well, that's where our enforcement is, we've been doing on a report basis, and I don't know how effective it is once we read a citation for one.
Yeah, the problem is they move it, and then a month later, it's back.
Or if you did, if it was less than 40 feet, if you could do a 24-foot width up to the garage, but not in front of the house, you'd have room for 2 vehicles adjacent to each other, but not parked right in front of the house.
That's kind of where I'm trying to figure out if there's a way for us to get that built into there, so when we do start enforcing these, you have to pave it, and it has to be here, and end of story. If you're gonna use it as a parking area.
So, enforcement. Whenever you have a regulation in a zoning code, okay, it's problematic in terms of enforcement. Because it's there one day and not the next, and then so on and so forth. And then basically, then you've got to prove it, and then you've got to give them a time to cure. And then they cure it, and then 2 months later, like you're saying, it's back in again. if this was a standalone municipal ordinance, okay? If they're in violation, you know, they can get a citation automatically. You don't have to go through the normal process of enforcement of a zoning code. That's the other option.
Yeah, similar to like grass. You get your one notice, and then after that, if it happens again, it's automatically
Right.
enforced. Or, I mean, yeah, there are other
Right.
situations where we do that. but-
Not only that, if it reoccurs, then they don't get the first notice. They just
Right.
get the citation.
Exactly, which we don't do today for those situations.
We do, or not for
Not-
parking because it's in the zoning code, right? But
Right.
in other situations, we do that,
Okay.
whether it's junk, long grass, that type of.
Right, might be something to take note of, because I know that's probably one of the largest complaint-driven things is the parking on the lawns and
It's certainly up there.
the reoccurring nature of which they exist. So you're saying they could still exist in zoning code, we just have to find a way in our
Parking would
enforcement.
be standalone.
Yeah, so parking would be standalone.
Well, okay. Probably.
Zoning provides provisions for parking, but the parking could be a parking, standalone parking ordinance.
Correct.
Gotcha.
On top of this, to say, if you're parking on the lawn, you're in violation of the standalone ordinance.
Gotcha.
If you have storage of, materials,
Mm-hmm.
that's in the next section, on top of this, then you're in violation of that standalone. So.
I think it's a great idea. I think we should make that procedural change as we go forward on that. It would allow us to just really get some movement on this whole enforcement bear that's been out there.
So, obviously, you've been talking about this, and just for my benefit, did you talk about the auxiliary parking bay idea? Does that kind of make sense, what it's intended for? Anything in particular that has to be modified or changed for that?
The only question I had there was the definition of a taper.
Yeah, it's just,
Well,
I know.
yeah.
Because they're gonna, yeah, you can't always unfortunately regulate for that one person who's gonna try and push the issue.
Right.
But
Yeah, there will be a graphic that shows some of these, standards for the parking bay.
Mhm.
So, and we'll label it taper,
Sure.
so.
I'll let you circle back with them on
Yeah.
that later.
Yeah, I can just follow up on that.
Okay.
There's small tweaks to the top one, but for sake of time, we'll
Okay.
have Adam circle back with you on the top.
So, I don't think we resolved the issue about a single car garage, having enough room for too wide parking. Right, that was your issue?
Well, and I see no reason not to allow it if there's room.
Right.
Because,
If there's a lot line, if the property exists in the lot and it works with some of the other right-of-way and setback requirements, I'm in agreement that we should allow it.
But that additional width is not gonna be in the front of the house, it's gonna be to the side of the garage,
Correct.
right?
Well, could be in front of the garage
To the
but not
right.
in front of the house.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if the house is to the left, that extra parking bay is to the right, or parking spot. Yeah. Or next to the
Okay.
garage, as it's been said. Get that in there somehow.
Yep. Okay. Anything else on the parking at all?
Just the next page, probably.
Yep. So, just kind of, preliminary remarks. People are having more and more stuff. They're buying more trailers, they're buying more toys, and so on and so forth. But having said that, that doesn't mean that you should write your regulations to accommodate the maximum number of whatever those people might have. I mean, you're looking at the community character, does it fit the neighborhood, so on and so forth. And not every parcel is basically made the same. Some are very just small, and you just can't say, well, if the neighbor has twice the lot area, can have whatever, then they can have that same amount on that smaller lot. I mean, it's just not something that is gonna work in every situation. So, that's why you've got some policy choices. One way of doing this is to simply say, you can store things, but it has to be on a hard surface. It's gotta be on the driveway, it's gotta be inside of a building, or it can be in the auxiliary parking bay. If it can't fit there, it's gotta be parked someplace else. So that's probably the easiest way of doing it, is if you have that hard surface, it can, you can park whatever there. The other way of doing it, and this is, I think, the way we wrote it, is you can have a trailer with a boat. Could have, bikes on it, whatever, could be parked someplace in your yard, but not on a hard surface. It could be in the backyard, can't be in the front yard.
And that would not include a recreational vehicle. So if it's a camper, it would have to be on hard surface.
Correct. So we've got motor vehicles, and then we've got RVs, and then we've got trailers.
So, clear.
Yep.
And then where's the property maintenance enter? Is that sort of just in the enforcement piece, that it's subjective in the sense that the grass and stuff is not being, I'm just trying to think about how practical this whole trailer piece is, because presently our code does not allow this, if I'm not mistaken.
Our code is silent on trailers specifically.
Oh, it's silent on trailers, wow, okay.
So it's whether or not we consider a trailer a vehicle. If we consider it a vehicle, then it has to be on hard surface. Traditionally, if it's been in the backyard and it's a boat or something like that that's moving once or twice a year, we have not made an issue of it, just because that would probably be a rabbit hole that would make membrane structures look like fun.
Anybody have any opinions about their
So
concerns?
a boat
with
can
waste?
be fine, but travel trailer is a no-go on unpaved service?
Travel trailer is not a motor vehicle.
That's what I'm questioning here.
According to this, a recreational vehicle would have to be on hard surface, correct?
Yep, or inside the garage.
But a pull-behind trailer is not a recreational vehicle. A gooseneck trailer is a trailer. It's not a vehicle. A vehicle can propel itself.
Correct.
Okay.
So,
It does say including recreational vehicles, so,
but a vehicle is, an RV is, you get in it and drive it.
yeah, I know, I
The
understand.
gooseneck trailer is still a trailer.
It's
So,
not a vehicle, okay.
no, and so that's why I think we need to be careful with this.
Yeah, it has to be very, very clear if you're gonna allow a travel trailer.
Because in my mind, it's like, does the thing have can it propel itself? Like
Right,
Joe was
that's a
saying,
vehicle.
A motorhome. for
Licensed
lack of a
motor
better
vehicle.
Yeah.
term.
A boat cannot propel itself on land, so it's sitting there.
Right.
And that's what I assumed, just since you're talking about a trailer not exceeding 30 feet in length, because traditionally, most boat trailers or other trailers are gonna be well under that, but a recreational trailer is going to be 30 feet.
Yeah, so the question is, do we want to allow campers, boats, anything other variety of trailers stored in the backyard on an unpaved surface, is one way to say it. I don't know, is there any other
Nope,
clarification?
that's it.
I can see it both ways. I can see problems, we have problems. We have some that have always done it and they've maintained it well. It's all in really the property maintenance piece as far as I'm
Yeah, I
concerned.
mean, if they're rutting, if they're tearing up the yard and things like that, then I guess that's another discussion, but I guess even as a planner, I'm torn on it. I would lean more to how this is worded and allowing it. I think there would be such shock in this community if you tried to say that all campers, boats, all those type of things had to be on a hard surface. I think, well, I guarantee that it would be at the council level very quickly with people asking for change. Now, whether or not that's a concern, I don't know.
I think my concern is get them out of the front yard.
And this would do that.
Yeah.
Whereas today it's pretty silent on,
Right, yeah, there's nothing preventing you from storing your camper in the front yard.
yeah, I'm
Or
agreeing
boat.
with Todd's comment, definitely. So with that said, are there other concerns with that area? Tim, anything we want to dive into further?
Probably, we just need to make sure that the terms are adequately defined, so we answer the questions about, what something is,
Yeah, good point.
so. Some of the numbers are, numbers. 30 feet, I mean, that's pretty good size.
Huge.
Yep.
If running is of concern, I mean, we could talk about vehicle weight, limit the weight that can be parked on.
But that's hard for somebody to ascertain.
I know.
You know, even on local streets, enforcing weight limits on trucks is hard because the department doesn't go scale vehicles, you know, the county does that, so.
I would prefer a size breakup. And from an enforcement point of view, it's easier to
can just measure.
get out there with a tape measure and say, this is 31.4 feet. You need to move it.
How tall are our average campers, like a pull-behind camper? Are they 10 feet? Is that high?
Mine
They're
is
they're
10.
10 feet
Yeah,
at
And
least.
if they have an air conditioning unit on
Yeah.
it, they're
12.
12-foot. And then, yeah,
So
I mean, I have a
Point they're not.
big pole building with a 12-foot door, and there've been some people that have wanted to store their camper in it, and they
Can't do it.
can't get in.
So in that case, this 10-foot height would, you know, if we're talking kind of that big, in people's backyards, they've got a 8-foot, what's our
Yeah, a
fence?
fifth wheel is gonna be over that.
We have a 6-foot fence, you know, people are trying to
Still
not
gonna
want to
see
see
it,
all their
yeah.
stuff, but at 10, you know, if it's the 10-foot might be a bit more of a compromise, I guess is what I'm saying, than having a 12-foot tall travel trailer in somebody's backyard that someone else has to look at, a neighbor has to look at, for example.
So is that the overall extent of it, including an air conditioning, or is it the actual size of the trailer? 'Cause, I mean, you're gonna get people that say, the trailer does not exceed.
Right.
I'm just trying to
Yeah.
poke holes in it.
Yep.
Right. I think it has to be including, I mean, I don't know why it wouldn't, I mean, the height is the height, as far as, I'm not enforcing it.
If you wanted to say 10 feet plus, you know,
Including all attachments, or?
right. I mean, that way we can write it that way because,
Height they're talking about?
yes,
Why not just give one of these dealers a call and see what the maximum height of trailers are?
I just saw one yesterday on the road that had to have been close to 14 feet.
13.6.
It was
13.6?
13.6.
You might not be able to clear some bridges with that.
Yeah, it was, I couldn't believe a 1-ton truck was pulling it.
So I would advocate for that 10-foot inclusive of all attachments, or unless we're thinking you know, at some point you kind of draw a line of what people can store in their city lot, residential lot, and where they should probably have storage for, I guess is
If
pretty.
a guy's got one, he's got it already, and it's more than 10 feet.
All travel trailers are gonna be more than 10 feet.
Right. 12.
If you're including
probably.
air conditioning, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, mine's a 20-foot long with air conditioning, now it's 10.6, I think.
But a 12-foot overall width, I think, is generally,
Height?
yeah, or a height.
So we're wanting to do that, we're wanting to,
say 12 feet.
I mean, we just talked about having it be where we were okay with the concept of people having moderately sized travel trailers in their backyard. And then if we were to limit the height so that it would exclude them, kind of,
So anything pre-19,
yeah.
pre-air conditioning, basically.
yeah.
Yeah. And most of them will have the air.
Yeah, right.
So we're going to 12 feet.
12 feet, and even there, I think we can not include AC units or
Right.
attachments like that. Because, you know, not only is this for RVs, it's for trailers with stuff. And that's why there's gotta be some maximum height. Okay. Okay,
That
anything else?
two-page section would be the longest discussion.
Okay. Well, that went fairly smoothly.
That's good, you missed the first.
Clear as mud.
Had to beat them into submission before you got here.
Quick, Tim's coming, hurry up. Okay. So coming back to the first page of the packet, is that the first part that you dove into?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we haven't
Okay.
covered anything else.
Okay, so let's go back to the first page of the staff report. on the second page, or I'm sorry, the first full page of the packet, the numbered page at the top, what we did is we added a little bit of, guidance in terms of conditional uses. Okay, we've got a whole section talking about process and so on and so forth. And one of the subsections says that as part of a conditional use, the Plan Commission can impose conditions, right? So that's just a general statement, and we just took that a little bit further to say that, these are some issues, and these are some potential conditions that you can impose, just by way of example. And by definition, a conditional use is that. It's essentially a use in a district that may or may not fit, right? Given the lot size, given the surrounding properties and uses and so on and so forth. And what you can do is to help make it fit, you can impose conditions to kind of bring it down and make sure that it fits. So these are some of the issues that might come up to say it really doesn't fit, the business is open too long. Well, as a condition of approval, you can say you're going to close earlier. There might be, concerns about noise. There might be concerns about the size of the building. There might be concerns about, people coming and going, the number of entrances, okay? So, in order to help it make it fit to address the concerns of the neighbors, you can impose conditions. Okay, so here are some examples. Does that kind of make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Because Plan Commission members come and go, and if they're reading this, they can say, oh, I didn't know that we could do that. Mm-hmm. So, okay. Third page of the packet, we added a whole section, relatively short section, but essentially this is to address situations where there's a larger use coming to town and there's concerns about traffic. People coming and going, and what we do is to say at some point in time the project becomes so big that traffic is a concern, and in order to help the city, figure out if that use is appropriate or not in that location, you're going to do a traffic impact study. And the threshold that we use is 750 trips per day.
So can you give an example of a land use that would likely be 750?
Home Depot for sure.
Walmart, so big box
Yes.
type of store?
Yes.
A McDonald's?
Um,
Just trying to think.
That might fall
Yeah,
under
already.
300 to 750.
yeah.
Just, I'm more asking,
Yeah.
well, I'm asking for my own enlightenment as well, but just.
Yeah, I mean,
so the
Quick Trip, for
commission kind of-
example, when that came through, where would they fall? Probably in that 3 to 750?
I think they went more than 750.
They did a traffic impact.
They did.
They did, I'm trying to
We
remember
required
the,
it.
I'm trying to
I thought it
remember
was
the
about
number.
3 cars.
Those Quick Trips are busy.
Yeah.
I mean, they just,
That'd be 180 an hour. And I think they probably would be pushing 750.
and there's really nothing magical about 750. It just seems to be a number that says, it's just larger than the normal.
It's warranted then.
It's warranted.
Okay.
And we identify who's going to be doing it. Obviously, the developer is going to be doing it. They're going to hire a transportation traffic expert, and they're going to be putting together a report identifying traffic circulation routes and with and without the project, and identify, ways to, take care of any negative effects. Okay. So basically, it's providing the city additional information so that they can make a well-informed, action on it. Okay. Okay. Page number 5 at the top, we've got a new section. This is enforcement. And here again, this is that formal process that you have to go through when it comes to a zoning code in terms of enforcement and allowing people time to cure. Okay? So this is going to be more of an interest to Adam and the city attorney.
Not interested.
Not interested yet.
One general question, notice of violation, I never actually researched it at the state level. Is it a requirement that it has to be certified mail, or does regular mail work for a violation?
Well, one of the issues that you get into is, well, I never received it.
Right. so it's recommended probably.
It's recommended, and that's why we say regular mail and certified.
I need to change my budget.
So I know in the past, we've had problems with Ray, you know, having someone sitting in their living room watching TV and he's staring at them through a screen door and they don't answer the door because they know why he's there.
Same thing with certified mail, though, they can refuse to sign for it.
Right.
Right, I think if the city sends it, it's a
It works
discussion
the first
pursued.
time, yeah.
But if it's sent, it's legitimate notice.
In fact, again, they have to, do you have to have both, or, I mean, this says both.
This
I'm
is reading both.
Yeah,
Yes.
I would suggest that you wouldn't have to send it certified, but again, I think that's a,
You're gonna run into the he said, she said, but
if it's,
how often, yeah, so that I'll probably discuss with Sue,
Yeah, I mean, it's
see what the city attorney recommends.
It's a policy question. Basically, what you want to do is, you know, make a strong written record so that when you go into court, you can say, we sent a regular mail, and we're pretty sure that the US Post Office is still in business. They
Yeah.
delivered it, and we also sent it certified. He didn't pick it up, that's documentation.
Right.
You got notice that you had something at the post office, you did not pick it up. That's your fault. So. Okay, so enforcement, and then we talked about parking and storage. The last time we met at 4:30, my apologies, I met at 4:30.
He came at
He came at 4:30
We
last
met
time
at
because of
4.
the Shane Roosh discussion.
Oh, that's right.
Yep, I had that stuck in my mind.
Execution.
Okay, last time we met, we had talked about a downtown design overlay district. And at that time, we were like, well, maybe we need a little bit more. Okay, and we said, provide us an example of what it might look like. So this is an example from Racine, where they actually have a document that was adopted by resolution. And it goes through and it identifies, you know, features of buildings, what's acceptable, what's inappropriate. And what's important to know is that this document is written as a guideline. Okay? When something says a guideline, it means just that. It's not required. So this is an example of a very graphic, very succinct approach to the standards. But in addition to this, then they still have the basic requirements as part of their zoning code. Okay? And quite honestly, there's not a lot of examples or other communities that do it this way. Did research, Stevens Point doesn't have a downtown design district, Wausau doesn't, any number of communities in the area don't have a downtown design district like you would have, and the ones that I did find were, you know, basically text. They didn't have, you know, this level of detail. So, that's what I found out.
So isn't, you know, looking at appropriateness and inappropriateness, isn't that really subject to the individual? You know, or the, you know, I mean, I'm looking at page 14, you know, where you see a residential, multi-family, you know, 60-unit complex. And to me, that looks very nice, and it's inappropriate. And when I look at the appropriate one above it,
I think the labels are mixed.
oh, okay. That must be it. All right. So, okay.
And in fact, you know, now that you pointed out, the one on the previous page, page 13, on their document, at the bottom it says inappropriate. Now, it could be the case that, and I'm pointing, looking at this one right here, it could be the case that the element that they're trying to say is inappropriate is just a portion of that graphic.
The Mexican
The arches.
arches, yes.
So, I mean, yeah, I mean, you can provide examples, but it's always like, well, is this a good example of what you're trying to say? And, you know, this is maybe a good example of, you know, some of the difficulty in finding good pictures that illustrate what you're trying to get at. So,
Yeah, good point. I think, yeah, each category is a little bit different in terms of what they're calling out. When I was looking through the photos too, I was like, oh, it actually looks kind of nice, or
Yeah.
even some of the masonry construction and some, but that's not what they're showing after I bring that out. It's a good one. There could be some that might be mistaken. So the city has, you know, any number of downtown plans, which some have been kind of alluded to some downtown design elements, I would say massing and those types of things. Knowing kind of what you've shared now with your limited research of like communities or neighboring communities, what do you suggest? I mean, this is obviously incredibly robust and goes to a great detail, but if we were to think about something for our community that, I mean, it's probably a matter of identifying what is it we want to really call out that's their higher priority items, and then offer some examples, or I guess
well,
share with us your thoughts.
This is long.
It's incredibly well done. I don't know how much it needs, how much of it applies here, or we even need to do here, but I do think there are elements that, you know, we may want to consider, especially as the few remaining original buildings really from when they were, the town kind of came to be, that still stand.
Right.
Protecting the character of those things and things, I think, is a community priority yet.
Yep.
As far as I know.
Some communities, what they do is if they have a downtown design district, they have a special architectural review committee. And there you have your architects and so on and so forth who serve on that body. The problem is, you know, finding the number of architects that you would want to have serving, but then they're gonna be reviewing their own work or their coworkers, or not their coworkers, but their competitors' work, and, you know, you're relatively, you know, I don't wanna say isolated, but, I mean, you just don't have a lot of, I don't wanna say, architects to draw on in the first place.
Right.
So, having said that, I mean, that is an option to have a separate architectural review body just for the downtown.
I think that would be difficult.
It's really difficult.
Maybe put the engineers in charge of reviewing the architects.
Create a whole lot of animosity.
There you go.
Mhm.
Payback.
Yeah.
Watch her, we'll put the planners over the engineers and then it'll.
You know, I do think there's, you know, there's been even today, there's still some discussion about wanting to have a discussion about a downtown vision and a downtown plan. I think, you know, character and zoning fits in there. And I'm just trying to figure out how prescriptive or restrictive maybe we want to be. I think you called out the demolition of buildings and maybe some sort of piece for that. And maybe we just need to come up with 3 to 5, if there is that many even, priority areas that we want to have illustrated or referenced within our zoning code. I'm thinking, you know, parking lots, for example, there's a lot to be said about screening, and, you know, we're kind of doing that through our code. But we just want to find some more of the downtown district kind of styling and add just the images in there, as opposed to just doing this very intensive, design booklet, whatever you're calling it, design guidelines. I mean, I see there's kind of a need for a small compromise in how to accomplish that.
Right.
Adam, do you?
I'm sorry.
No, just anybody else.
I was just gonna ask, would it be appropriate to have some very basic language that references the comprehensive plan? That, you know, because that's reviewed, you know, there's a process for that, it's over a period of time. You know, where some of those general standards are more laid out in the format of a comprehensive plan, and then the zoning requires some consistency with that versus,
Yeah, I mean, our comprehensive plan, it has basically nothing that would support any of this.
Right.
It's because it's so generic. I mean, our waterfront plan is the one I would reference as being probably that one that you would tie it to. That one has some design standards in there, which, as the mayor noted, that's more your, talks about bulking, it talks about, preserving transom windows and some of those general architectural type of concepts, and then talks about parking lot screening, those type of things. So it's a more generic version of this. Similar in concept, it's a plan that was adopted. It could be reviewed, it could be updated, it could be replaced, and then you would probably just change the reference in the zoning code at that time, as opposed to our comprehensive plan, because it's just too, you cover too much with the comprehensive plan. If you have a really good comprehensive plan, maybe that works. There's a reason we have Tim putting lipstick on our current one. I don't feel it's a very good one.
I just, and I mention it just because, there's certain aspects of the zoning code that seem to fit really well in the zoning code. But specific design influences generally aren't, you don't find that in the zoning code.
Other than us trying to do kind of a form-based code hybrid here that has guidelines and, but yeah, you're right, generally it's text and that's it. And I think, an objective for me in this whole process is trying to get beyond just sort of that basic cookie cutter mindset of how we do things, right? How our architects and builders and designers in the city do business. And I know there's a cost component to that, but to the extent that adding certain things or requiring certain things can kind of inform or, push a little bit better design, better to me, I guess, kind of subjectively. But, and that might be just the way we accomplish it, is just to reference that downtown master plan that was approved or the waterfront plan that was approved in '07.
Does have I
Or 12,
provided
sorry,
that
12.
to all of you at any point? Is that
2012.
something that would be helpful for you to get copies of? Kind of
2012's plan, not 7. I said '07. It's the 2012 plan.
Yeah, it was just before I started.
I think I have a copy of that.
I can certainly get copies to you guys.
It's a broad brush, but I think it gives people something that, it's a document that we invested in, the community spent quite a bit of time. I just feel like there should be some tie-in that.
It's
that
what
has
we
some
reference for
applicability here.
downtown facade program.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of our guiding document for that. And that's because there's city funds being utilized for those structures. So that's how we've tried to tie it in, at least on a limited basis. But there's nothing that says you can't take that next step and tie it in further.
I think that's a good place to start, as opposed to necessarily spending a lot of time developing something like this. I mean, not to say it wouldn't happen at some point.
right.
Sometimes it's best to kind of incrementally, feel your way through and see if there's a problem. If there's a problem, then you come up with a solution.
I have to run, excuse me. I'll turn the gavel over to Todd to run.
There you go.
Thank you all.
Okay. Okay. Based on that, let me just hand out something. We can walk through it real quick, and maybe we can kind of, so this is new. This is a second draft of the downtown design article. Okay, Article 15, as it's numbered right now. On the second page, we had talked about, the question was, what about demolishing buildings? Okay, and so essentially, if somebody is demolishing a building, they can do it. Okay, because there's nothing that would prevent them in the zoning code from demolishing a building if it's falling down or whatever. If it's historic, that's something separate, and you would have a separate ordinance. But essentially, if they're demolishing anything, then they have to do a site plan. Okay, because the issue is if it's downtown, it's going to be next to sidewalks and so on and so forth, and you want to make sure that you've got control over how soon they restore it and so on and so forth. Okay, so that is a proposed way of dealing with buildings that are being raised or demolished.
What about parking lots being demolished?
To rebuild them, or?
Is
Is
it
this
a
when
site plan, to have a site plan review of what's gonna happen after the parking lot is torn out?
Is there an example?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was gonna say.
I mean, it's just a parking lot we got a lot of questions on because it was a asphalt parking lot and then it's torn up now and it's basically just gravel and sand.
And some of the structural highlights for the parking lot remain. It becomes a blight feature.
Okay. So, was the parking for a specific building, or was it just a parking lot, and that's what it was, or?
It was across the street from the building it was intended to serve. So it wasn't actively being used as a parking lot.
I see.
Once it was purchased.
Okay.
So I think that's such an extreme example that I don't think we need to regulate
But I'm thinking
anything like
of,
that in here, but
in general though, if there's alterations happening inside this district, to be able to have some kind of site plan review of them so that it is, you know, consistent with downtown planning.
Right. So basically, the site plan process is if you're building something new or altering something, if you're modifying landscaping, putting in additional parking, you've got to do a site plan for all commercial and multifamily and institutional industrial buildings. So the same principle would apply if they're taking something out. I would say that the site plan review would apply to them as well, because they're modifying the site. So that's how I would approach it. If you modify a site, you know, you have to go through the process.
above and beyond taking down a bush and planting a new tree or something like that, obviously a substantial change, which I would think that would be considered a
Sure.
substantial change.
So I think that issue might be taken care of as part of the new code.
Okay.
Okay. So we talked about demolition. And then as I was doing, you know, some more research on, you know, downtown design districts and so on and so forth, under building design, I added subsection 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay? So maybe what we can do is go through these design principles one by one to see if it might be helpful if there was a graphic to show appropriate, inappropriate, or an example of something that we're trying to get across. Does that kind of make sense? And maybe we can add some graphics. So building height, you know, I think is fairly well defined. So if you think there's a graphic that might be appropriate, let me know. But on the face of it, I think building height is pretty well understood. Yes? No?
So adjoining, attached to, or is it just in the lot next to?
Most of the buildings in the downtown design district are going to be zero lot line
Okay.
on the site. So they're going to be buildings right next to each other. But yeah, I mean, if there's an intervening parking lot of whatever, that principle would still apply.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Building mass is a little bit, I'm going to say, warm and fuzzy, but it's hard for, you know, people to kind of figure out what that means. So maybe that's an example of, you know, a graphic that we could add. Yes? No?
Mhm. I think that this concept is difficult to, a graphic would help.
Okay.
Definitely.
I'm having a little hard time too with, you know, in general, building height, to me, that makes sense, but, you know, if there were a development that required a 4 or 5 story building, and there was a two-story building adjacent to it, I could see where there might need to be, some type of accommodations and review process to make sure that it, in fact, could be compatible, but
Well, especially because right here, this area that we're trying to develop, if we're looking at possibly 3 or 4 levels there in the triangle, and then all of a sudden you're got 2 stories right next to it.
And I think of like my office building on the river there, there's the 1-story portion in between, right next to a 3-story portion, so. And then it would, there's no reason to not have.
right.
I mean, it doesn't.
But even, I mean, it's yes and no, I guess. I'm trying to picture the frontage. So you've got the Elks, which is 3 acres, and you've got the former Wood County Television, which is, or Wood County Telephone, which is what, I mean, it's almost a story and a half. And then you've got your building, which is 3, right?
And then there's the little connector building between them.
Oh, okay, right on the
That's
river
the-
you're talking.
That's
Not
the
on
1-story
frontage.
portion.
Okay.
Couldn't we just apply for a variance if we had to have a situation like you were talking about?
I don't know variance though, but conditional.
Plan development,
conditional
right.
use.
I mean, if you're having a development of that size, you could certainly do it at the Triangle, for example, if it's going to be a whole redevelopment of a block at plan
Well, that
development.
doesn't
is
come in
not-
contact with any other building anyway, does it?
Right.
Right.
So that one doesn't,
No, but you said if it's separated by a parking lot,
Right.
this is,
Or a street.
So, perhaps one way of dealing with that is to say the height of a building shall not be more than 2-story higher than the adjoining. I mean, that way, if it's 2, you can go 4, if it's 3, you can go 5.
Or 3 down to 1.
Right. So the issue is not dwarfing, what's there.
Right.
okay.
Or building something so small that it's out of character with a 4-story or a 3-story.
Obviously, it's more of a concern if you have a continuous, you have 2 blocks in a row
Yeah.
of 3-story buildings, and also you end up with a 1-story right smack dab in the middle. It looks weird.
Right, 2 stories larger, 1 story smaller, maybe might be appropriate, because you could say a 5-story next to a 3-story doesn't look quite as odd as a 1-story next to a 3-story.
Okay. So maybe that'll address some of the variation. Because, yeah, I mean, in your downtown, you do want to have more dense uses, okay? But even there, what we could do is build in a special exception process, if that makes sense. Okay, so we'll play with that. Okay, building mass, we kind of talked about. We'll do a graphic perhaps for that. Number 3, essentially, the standard here is to make sure that you don't end up with long continuous walls along the side or the front of a building. So essentially, and 150 feet is, fairly big. But essentially, if there's a building that wide on the frontage, then it has to be designed so it looks like there's individual buildings, even though it's one business or one facility. And there's a lot of different ways of doing that. So does that requirement kind of make sense in what it's trying to accomplish?
I don't know what it's trying to accomplish, to tell you the
Well,
truth.
okay, if driving through the downtown, essentially, most of the buildings are skinny,
Okay. Okay,
a lot of them.
so you don't want to, say, a big box store going in a Hobby Lobby or something next to,
Right.
okay.
Have you ever seen the Walmarts? I've even seen it with a Walmart where they've made it they've tried to make it look like a downtown building on having false fronts to break up.
No.
Madison, south side of Madison, that's, their Walmart is like that.
Take something like the Mead Witter block downtown Rapids, would that comply if you were to do it today as it is?
Probably not, because it's one continuous facade.
But
I
it's
mean,
got-
it's designed to look like
It
one
does, but
continuous
it's got
facade.
separate storefronts,
Correct.
so that breaks it up pretty much.
Right.
A lot of times, as long as it still has that feel of individual bays, it's still gonna meet this intent. I mean, I've seen like a multi-story mixed-use building where you've got the residential above, so they'll at least articulate the building back and forth, or they'll use a different color material or something like that, so it's not just one long, same red brick building. They'll at least break it up. And so that's the intent, so it's just not this long flat, or that long continuous repetitive look.
Okay. The fourth one basically deals with, if you look at a lot of the downtown buildings, they typically have a lot of the same features, horizontal features, and you don't want to, basically come up with a different pattern. You want to mirror the pattern that is on the existing buildings. So that's what number 4 and 5 are trying to get at. Okay. So number 6, roof forms. Typically, most of the buildings in the downtown are flat roofs. So you don't want to see, mansard roofs or anything goofy like that. What's that?
The river block being an example of a building that doesn't fit the character of the
Okay.
street.
Awnings are allowed. But back in the 50s and 60s, they did a lot of goofy things with awnings. Sometimes you see them with shingles on them, and so on and so forth. So this basically says it's got to be of the old style, and it can't have under lighting underneath.
So now
That shows through.
considered part of the building for setback requirements and such?
Basically, no.
So it
Awnings
could-
can extend over the public right of way.
Okay.
So the question is, does the city of Wisconsin Rapids, do you require them to, enter into a separate agreement with the city with regard to insurance and those kinds of issues?
I do not believe so.
Right, not
Okay.
traditionally, no.
Okay. Because essentially what you're doing is allowing people to build over the public property.
Right.
Just like you are for a sidewalk cafe or something like that, the council's giving permission for those activities to take place, and
Right.
and with sidewalk cafes, I believe we require insurance and other.
Correct. Yep, and a hold unless.
Right. So maybe, probably, looking at that same concept for awnings that, extend over into the public right of way. And then, the sad fact is, the reason why is, people get sued, and they sue anybody and everybody if something happens.
Would this include like a marquee
Yep.
sign that has lighting? Because you said no, that can shine through, so, but like typical marquees, it's flat,
It's
it's not an
gonna be
awning.
downlighting,
Right,
it's not gonna
downlighting.
be backlit,
Right.
yeah, so that would
Okay.
be different.
Right. Basically, the backlit awnings are the ones that kind of have a plastic covering, and then they put the lights underneath, and then it just lights up like a huge beacon.
Okay.
Building materials.
Do we want to include a statement in the awnings language? Something about permitting and hold harmless agreements or something like that? Or not really?
It should be mentioned. I'm not sure it should be mentioned here or someplace else.
Okay.
We'll add something.
What about any like clearance requirements?
That's covered in your streets and sidewalks section already. I believe it's an 8-foot minimum clearance,
I think so.
just going up. I
And
believe.
the other issue is, you know, I'm not sure about here in the city, but sometimes you have state roads and county roads going through downtown. So there, they would have to do the hold harmless agreement, because you can't do that for them, so. Building materials, you know, there are just some things that just don't fit. So number 9, the term is four-sided architecture. Basically, front, sides if there are any, and on the back side. Have to be similar in terms of the architectural detail and materials. Now, having said that, you know, sometimes buildings front on an alley. Are you concerned about the appearance of the buildings from an alley?
Over time, yes. You never know when that alley will turn into a outdoor beer garden or something like that. But you've seen communities that have
Yep.
begun to redo those type of things as public spaces. That's just me.
Mhm. Does that kind of make sense?
It does, or the back of the building is adjacent to an alley.
Right. Okay. Entrances, this is an architectural, you know, something that should make common sense, but sometimes building entrances are kind of an afterthought in terms of the overall architecture. So this is basically saying, you know, I mean, the building focus should be on the entrance to draw the pedestrian traffic to it. Number 11 talks about the street edge. And essentially what we're trying to do, and I'm sure this is, you know, a theme in the waterfront plan, is basically drawing people downtown and having a pedestrian feel. And the way of doing that is to create interest along the sidewalk. And you do that any number of ways, architecture, and that's what 11 is trying to get at. Is having all, you know, sufficient details that it makes it interesting that people want to walk there in the first place. Okay. Number 12, basically getting a little prescriptive here, but the old style building in a typical downtown, they're typically narrow and tall. So you don't want to have a brand new building right next to it that is just a wide expanse of a window. You can have that. You can have that amount of window, but they have to be broken up into individual window panes. Number 13.
Hang on a second. If there are a cluster of windows, however, I'm just trying to think, there's probably a number of examples where you may have multiple, you know, maybe a wall of the building that is essentially a lot of windows, but that the design is, you know, you know, it might be quite tall, but it might be 3 or, you know, 2 panes with an arch, or
Are you talking more individual window panes or the overall facade? Like, so the glass.
The actual
area.
window unit.
okay.
So the individual window unit.
The
would need to
the
be
individual
updated.
panes aren't,
That's what I
Okay.
think this is trying to get at, is
Okay.
the individual pane needs to be taller than it is wide. So the entire front facade, and they end up not looking that way. If
Okay.
that makes sense.
right, so I mean, if you had, you know, something like this where, you know, it's wider than it is tall, but you know, each individual pane might not be taller than wide.
It's
but
basically the window unit.
the window unit, okay. Okay, I just wanted to be clear.
Yep. And maybe we can, you know, say the window unit.
Sure.
Or a graphic might help with that one too.
Okay.
Would square be acceptable? Is that the threshold, the bottom of it, is square to rectangular? Or, I mean, this goes back to the technicality, then you need something that's a ½ inch taller than it is.
Well, and I mean, there's buildings where you've got a one-story building and the storefront is glass and it's wider than it is tall, right? I mean, the whole storefront is glass. That window unit would be wider than it is
And yeah,
tall. I
like
mean, it could be
jewelry
10 or
stores
12 foot
are-
tall, but, 25 feet wide,
Yeah,
multiple
but a lot of
panes.
times you'll have a doorway in the middle that breaks up the individual window panes or something, so it still is breaking that up, so you still have that vertical look to it, but.
Is
I
this
mean-
something that we want to regulate?
I could see where you wouldn't want a small height, wide width window, but if, for example, if the entire front of the building is glass, it is most likely going to be wider than it is tall.
Right, I mean, you look at Mulligan's and Shawley and stuff like that, they're not wider than they are tall, they're real
Pretty
close.
close.
Even like from the ground up, I'm trying to picture it's a big picture window, it's all glass, but yeah, I mean, whether or not it's actually narrower or wider, I would have to measure or pay closer attention to, but,
Or if there's
So-
a knee wall
yeah.
and the rest of the front of the building is all glass, then it's most definitely wider than it is tall.
So as drafted, this is very prescriptive. I mean, that way you can measure it, and as long as it's, dimensions are correct, you're fine. It could be, written such that the windows of the proposed building should match those of the surrounding windows. I mean, that way there's more flexibility, and that might help if that's what you're trying to get at.
Or if we're trying to avoid a building that has a small amount of windows, there could be an exception there that, unless the glazed area of the front of the building exceeds 70% or something else so that we're, what are we trying to avoid here?
And I
That's
mean,
most unlikely in this day and age, Joe. Probably years and years ago, they had like Johnson Hill, the old Johnson Hill building was glass right all the way across, but now they want to use that space for materials or
They don't want to put in
inventory
windows.
and that
Right,
kind of
but
thing.
for example, there's a remodeling project going on right now on Grand Avenue.
Yeah.
And the front of those buildings are all e-glass, right? And
Yep.
Quite honestly, I think section 4 and 5, when you're talking about horizontal and vertical rhythm, I think that's getting at the same basic thing. I mean, it's not specific to the windows, but I think that's still covering what you're trying to do with the taller and wider.
Okay.
It says,
so maybe omit it.
I guess
As a
I don't
specific
know that
item?
it's needed, but
I
I think it should be omitted. I think it's an unnecessary constraint.
I'd just say omit it, just omit it, don't worry about it.
Okay. The last one in that section talks about transparency requirements. And here again, this goes back to creating an inviting pedestrian feel. And glass does that. You can look in, you can see what's there, you can window shop, so on and so forth. And the threshold is 25% of the ground floor facade has to be transparent. It could be doors, it could be windows, it could be whatever. And those windows, in turn, can't be tinted. They can't be, darkened. They have to be transparent.
So that would help exclude some certain types of businesses from the downtown.
Yes, it would, yeah.
around the low, I guess. Or they just get smart and they put picture window type things and then
And
it's
then
closed
something
off from the
behind it.
backside.
Sure.
That's immediately where I went on that.
Okay.
nose prints on windows.
You want excitement downtown.
Okay. So, this is all good. So we'll come back with a third draft. Hopefully we can get some graphics between now and the next meeting, but if not, we'll just have placeholders where we can put them in afterwards. Okay? That's all I had, about an hour and a half. Okay? Believe it or not, we've gone through every article, and we've gone through some articles multiple times, and what I'll be doing is putting everything into final form, into final organization with the correct article numbers and so on and so forth, and we'll be getting a draft to Adam, that he can start reviewing it, perhaps for the second time, or verifying that corrections have been made and issues are being, taken care of. So the other missing piece to the whole zoning code is the zoning map. And we'll have a draft of that at the next meeting. Okay?
And do we have a date on the next meeting?
If we follow what we have been doing, it would be the third Monday. Which would be, let's see, in October, that would be the 16th.
At 4 o'clock.
4 o'clock.
Sorry.
Okay. Any further discussion? Seeing none, entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second. We have a motion to adjourn and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned at 5:30.